In this video, we'll continue using Fusion 360 forms to create the front end of a Subaru WRX. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and today we're going to carry on our series on Fusion forms. The series was intended to be an introduction to forms, but it actually turned into a little bit more of a complex workflow because we're modeling the front end of a Subaru WRX. So in this video, we're going to carry on with what we've done in the previous videos, where we added a creased ridgeline as opposed to using two edges really close together. And we are carrying this over at this point where we now have to flare the fender out, or we need to carry the front edge of the hood over so we can connect to our wheel arches. And again, there's no right or wrong way to go about this process in terms of deciding which direction to go first. Since in the last video we created our wheel arches and we started to extrude the top edge of the fender, in this video I'm going to start to work from the front edge and continue moving that over. If you'll remember last time, we did identify a few problem areas. There are things that we need to fix, but for right now, we're not too worried about these areas. I will say that sometimes we can get away with fixing these by selecting an edge, deleting it so that it's able to smooth itself out, then coming back and inserting an edge, or by using an insert point. So for example, going from here to the midpoint of this edge, we can say, okay, and sometimes that will fix the geometry. And again, we can go back and select insert point. And sometimes we can maybe make triangles or we can extend those patches out. But again, this is an area that we're going to have to focus on. We know we're going to have to come back and make some changes, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. Those details can really eat up a lot of time, and it's probably better for us to continue on making bigger strides and then come back to those smaller details. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on this fender detail over, and I'm going to sort of connect it to the wheel arch. When we do this, note that we have a creased edge here, and I want to select a couple of edges. I'm going to grab these three edges, and I'm going to do this from the front view to start. We're going to go to Modify Edit Form, the tool that we've been using for pretty much everything. We're going to hold down Alt on the keyboard to extrude, and we're going to begin pulling this out. Notice that as soon as we do this, we are now seeing a very different geometry being created. When it extrudes it, it really brought this edge quite farther out than we wanted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reshape this a little bit. I'm going to grab that face, I'm going to bring it down, keeping in mind that we are going to make some more drastic changes. So at this point, let's go to a box display so we have a better idea of what's underneath. So back in the front view, we want to make sure that we pull everything and get it roughly in line. We don't want to have to deal with geometry that is not good. So we want to make sure that everything is nice and even. So I'm going to take this edge and pull it back a little bit, and probably take this vertex and pull it back. So now that we have those lined up, when we're looking at this from the front, this looks pretty good. We're going straight across, and now I want to extrude it again. So I'm going to do a box select to grab those edges, hold down Alt, and begin bringing it back. But this time, before I deselect those, I want to go to a top view, and I actually want to rotate them. I'm going to rotate them and begin pulling them back. If we go to a smooth display, what we're doing is we're trying to transition this shape back. I'm going to box select this. I'm going to box select these edges and pull them back a little bit, and maybe rotate them just a little bit more. We're looking to carry that creased edge around, and again, we can spend a lot of time adjusting the shape, but we are going to have to cut some stuff out for the headlight, so we're not going to spend too much time finalizing it just yet. But we do want to grab those edges again, this time from the right. Holding down the Alt key, we're going to bring that back. And as we get a little bit closer, I'm going to let go of the Alt key. I'm going to do one final pull to about right there. And then I'm going to left click. Next, I'm going to grab these edges on the bottom. And again, top left to bottom right, we'll be able to grab just the edges in that box. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit closer. This transition is going to be tricky because we have a creased edge here. That creased edge is going to be problematic, and we need to decide how we would to terminate that into the rest of the geometry. So my first attempt here is to go to Modify, and I want to use Weld Vertices. I'm going to weld these two vertices here. As soon as I do that, notice that everything goes into box display. Now, oftentimes when we get a box display like this, it generally means that there's a problem and we can't go back to smooth display. And that's because we've got this open edge here. We've got one vertex and it's been welded to another, but this edge is just open and it doesn't know how to reconcile that in smooth display. So in order for us to really get that to work, we need to transition the shape into the rest of the geometry. In order to do that, I'm going to try a few things. I'm going to begin by selecting these edges, and I'm going to start by pulling them up. Now, by pulling them up, what I'm doing is I'm getting this edge and this edge roughly the same length, and then we're going to see what that transition does when we go back to smooth display. So we'll go to Modify. This time we'll take a look at merging the edge. So I'm going to take this as my first edge, and this is my second edge, and I'm going to say OK and put those together. Now you can see we're back in smooth display. It's showing that crease, that transition going up. And you can see here that this section, which was basically the top level of that, and is now transitioning. I'm going to go back to a box display, and I want to take this edge from a front view, and I actually want to bring it up and over. The reason I want to bring it up and over is because I'm taking this crease up and I want it to blend and sort of fade away. So I want to bring this up and get it a little bit closer, go back to a smooth display, and let's just see what it looks like. So that looks pretty good. And if I use Control and 4 on the keyboard, don't pay too much attention to this crease or transition here because we don't have any other geometry. But that transition, how it goes up the fender, actually looks pretty good. Again, there's a lot of detail work that we can do. We need to determine in the real car how that transition actually works. And in reality, what happens is that transition happens a lot lower. So what that means is we're going to have to make some adjustments to the shape of the fender. And the reason I did that box select for that is because we actually have the entire line of vertices behind it. And because we're dealing with symmetry, box selecting here would grab the ones on the other side of the car, but that's not really a problem because they're going to move anyways. But moving that down means that we likely need to add another cut or another edge in here. So we're going to go to Modify, Insert Point. I'm going to go from the back mid to the front, and then I'm going to come up to this edge here and say OK. And then I'm going to box select that, go to my right view. I'm going to go Modify, Edit Form, and I'm just going to add a little bit of an arc there. So again, smooth transition, and you can see how everything sort of works out. So now we have a little bit more freedom to move this around. We can move that, that entire edge down if we want to. And again, we need to be mindful of what we're selecting. So box select, pull this down a little bit, and then let's take a look at these transitions. So everything here looks okay. Keep in mind that when you have these sort of transitions, they do tend to flare out. So having that flare out is okay, but we might want to move this out a little bit. Check it out in a smooth display. You might want to add another section of edges in here if we want it to go straight back and then flare out. But it's looking okay. I mean, we could do more with this, but we could also kind of leave it as is until we get more detail. It's always important to remember that as soon as we add more detail, as we begin adding more edges and more features, it's going to change some of this underlying geometry. So spending a lot of time now getting all of these tiny little details perfect is going to be a waste of effort. It's really something that you need to get the shape close, and then we can begin subdividing it and adding more edges and getting the shape a lot closer. But when we take a look at the car, like these transitions are usually going to be the hardest. They're going to be very difficult because we're transitioning from a creased edge and we're blending it into something smooth. And those creases tend to disappear. And in reality, we would love to say, this is 100% crease, this is 0%, and just have it fade away on that edge. And that's unfortunately not possible using these tools. We have to really force the issue manually. I'm going to go back to a box display. And I'm going to make some adjustments here. I want to pull this back a little bit. And I have to decide what to do with this. Do I want to continue to sort of make extrusions off of this edge and blend them in, or do I want to try to merge some edges? I think in this case, I'm going to select these edges. I'm going to use Alt, and I'm going to extrude them out. Then I'm going to say OK, go to Modify Weld Vertices, and I'm going to bring these two together. And then I'm going to take a look at it in Smooth Display. So in Smooth Display, that obviously doesn't look like the real car, that hard edge transitioning up. But again, until we add more geometry, we don't really know what's going to happen. And this is the point on the car where we have that sort of boxed fender flare. So if we bring back our canvases and we bring back our side view, this is where we need to decide how the geometry is going to take shape. So I'm going to start at the back edge here. I'm going to begin at these two faces, or these two edges, I should say. And I'm going to bring them back, extruding them using Alt, and then I'm going to modify their position. This is something that we can do in Smooth Display or we can do in Box Display. It really depends on your workflow. And then I'm going to take these two edges at the top and I'm going to extrude them up. And then once again, I'm going to grab a vertex. I'm going to pull that up, grab this one, pull it up. And now we sort of have created this area here. Now, if we want to continue this, we can continue extruding these out, and then we need to begin to decide, well, are we making triangular patches anywhere, or are we going to pull these two together? Are we going to pull these two together? And what is that shape really going to look like? Remember, at this point, we want to be careful not to add too much detail. So we're going to weld these vertices together. I'm going to select these two, weld them together, and I'm going to select these two and weld them together. Then I'm going to take a look at the Smooth Display. So that looks okay, pretty smooth transition. We can pull it in if we want some curvature. We can use Modify, and I'm going to go to a front view so I can kind of see the curvature. And I'm going to just pull that in slightly. So you can see that we've got a slight rounding here, and that's typically what you would see coming away from a fender opening. Next, we can begin to connect, and you'll notice that we've got two edges here and we've got one, and we want to try to keep these four-sided patches whenever possible. So in this case, I'm going to use my bridge tool. I'm going to go from this edge to this edge here. I'm going to say one face because that's how many we have in between here. I can show a preview if I want. It's not really going to do much for me. But what it's done is it's created that extrude for us going between those two edges. So now if we go back to Smooth Display, we can see what we're creating. We can see what's starting to happen here. But when we view it from the right, this is where that flare is, that box flare. So I think this is going to end up being a triangle. I don't know that I can make it a four-sided patch. We can certainly try, but we need to get this flared out section. So in order to do that, once again, I'm going to extrude. I'm going to hold down the Alt key. I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to say OK. And then I want to use that. Actually, I want to continue to use Edit Form, and I'm going to bring this down, potentially bring this entire edge down. So that way it gives me a little bit more room to have that four-sided patch. And again, keeping everything consistent, moving everything in plane, being careful that we don't move things in 3 dimensions at once. We're only trying to work in either one direction along an axis or in a plane. So I'm going to try to match that. And then I can continue with these two. I can make the selection here, hold down Alt and extrude those up, pulling them slightly away from here because I want to merge it. And I'm going to say OK here. So let's weld these vertices and say OK. So now we're beginning to build that fender flare. If we take a look at a Smooth Display, it doesn't really look like much yet. But what we're doing is we're starting to define that upper edge of the flare. So when we look at this from the front and we bring back our front image, we need to start coming in and then up and connect to this. Now we can do this in a number of different ways, but again, just continuing to extrude using that modify edit form is probably going to be the best option. Once again, we're going to come back later and add more detail. So I'm going to use Alt on the keyboard. I'm going to extrude this up. If you want to show the front, then you certainly can. And then I'm going to hold down Alt again. I'm going to extrude one more time coming up. And then we'll take a look at this from the right side. So this is the beginning of that flare. And if I want to, I can bring this edge down a little bit. I can bring this edge down a little bit. And noting that as we're looking at this, the fender of the car or like the hood is not coming back nearly far enough. And that's because we never really carried it back. We don't have a top view, but we never really carried this geometry back. So in order to carry that back, I am going to make some selections. I'm going to begin by just selecting these, and I'm going to pull these back. Then I want to view this from the top, and I want to bring some of these other edges back as well. Might go down to the vertex level. And what we're really looking to do here is make a smooth transition. So if we go back to our smooth display, you can see that the transition looks a little bit better than box display, but we still want to keep these consistent. So that is always going to be the key, is you don't want to have any wild changes in curvature that happen in the middle of an edge. You want to keep them consistent so it is nice and smooth. So now when we view this from the side, now we're a little bit closer to that back edge. We don't have the same number of divisions, which means that we need to make some adjustments. I'm going to take this and I'm going to actually pull it forward a little bit and try to get it closer to this edge. And then I'm going to divide up the rest of this body by adding some edges in there. While we can connect them to an open edge, we can add a point and we can actually break that edge up. The geometry generally doesn't work very well. So I'm going to use insert edge in this case. I'm going to double click this edge. I'm going to bring it over to about there. And then I'm going to repeat the process using this one. I'm going to bring it over to about here. When we do that, we have to be careful because we just introduced some curvature that was unintended. So we need to make sure that we do go back and we fix that at least at this point, and we'll say okay. Now we can come back and we can do merge edge. I'm going to say 1, 2, and 3 edges on one side, and then this side here I'm going to do 1, 2, and this third one, and I'm going to say okay. So now what we've done is we've merged those edges. But if we go to our smooth display, if we hide our blueprints, that is not the fender flare that we are expecting to see. We're expecting to see harder transitions. If we look at the front, we are hoping that this is actually a crease. So I'm going to select it and I'm going to crease it. I'm also going to crease this edge here. Now, this is temporary because we are not going to be artificially doing the creases forever. We're just using it during the design phase. And as we're doing this, one thing that is apparent is that merge edge did not actually push those vertices together. So we're going to use weld vertices and we're going to make sure that we position them properly. I want these transitions to be in the right position as they move. So now we're getting a little bit closer to what that fender flare transition would look like. We have more work that we need to do in this area. Obviously, we haven't continued the geometry up here, but we do want to maybe move this edge in a little bit. So using modify edit form, we'll bring that in, and then maybe we'll pull some of this other geometry out. So I'm going to go back to a front view, and on the car, the transition is more rounded, so it actually comes up and into that crease a little bit. Let's go ahead and use Control-4 on the keyboard, and now you can see we've got that crease coming down and around, and it sort of fades up into the fender. And then we've got the startings of the fender flare. And again, we're going to go back and we're going to fix these creases in the corner that happen because we haven't finished the geometry. And we're going to add more to the transitions. We'll likely go back and add a bevel, which will give us that true curvature continuous transition. But for right now, we're going to use those creases to our advantage. So this is a pretty good place for us to get to. Still a lot to do. Hopefully you are still sticking with it, because if you want to produce models with the form tools in Fusion 360, you are going to have to sort of work through this process on your own. You're going to have to play around, you're going to have to experiment, and you're going to have to be okay with going back to the drawing board at some time. Like, we've already talked about how the front is not ideal. We know that we're going to have to fix some bad geometry in this area. It's something that we're going to have to come back to. There's a little ripple here that we need to take care of. And there are just things that we generally need to fix. But that's okay because we're looking at the bigger picture. We're looking at the bigger shape, and we're going to deal with the big stuff first, and we're going to come back and worry about those details later. At this point, make sure that you do save your file because we've done a lot of work. We don't want to lose anything. And this way we can always come back to the previous version or the previous state. But if you have any questions or if you've had any trouble to this point, please leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to try to answer those. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.